The wage trap is not something that happens to weak men or lazy men or men who lack ambition. It happens to the hardest working men I ever knew. Men who arrived early and stayed late. Men who took on extra responsibility without being asked. Men who were genuinely good at what they did and knew it and still found themselves, after a decade of excellent work, in roughly the same financial position they had been in at the start. More comfortable perhaps, better respected within the organization, but not fundamentally different, not free, still showing up because the wage required showing up. Still dependent on the approval of someone above them for the money that sustained everything they had built around themselves. Still in the trap, just a more comfortable version of it. The specific mechanism by which the trap works, how it closes around the hardest working men, as surely as around the least ambitious, and the specific sequence of steps that breaks it, is what I'm going to describe to you in full detail. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you will understand something about money and work and building that most men figure out only after they have already spent the best years of their working life inside the trap. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from an engine in a shed. I built the moving assembly line. I built the $5 workday when $2.30 was the standard, and everyone in the industry said I was out of my mind. I built River Rouge, the largest integrated manufacturing complex in the world at the time it was operating, and I spent the years before all of that working for wages, working for Thomas Edison's company, working for other men's systems in other men's directions at wages other men determined. I know the wage trap from the inside, not from observation. From the specific experience of a man who was in it and understood, in a specific moment of clarity, exactly how it worked and what it would take to get out. I am going to describe that moment and that understanding and the practical steps that followed it, because they are the same steps available to you, starting today, in whatever situation you are currently in. Listen to this every day until the thinking in it is your default. The man who hears this once gets a framework. The man who hears it 30 times starts making different decisions. Here is how the wage trap actually works at the mechanical level, because the mechanism is not the obvious one, and most people who are inside it have never had it described precisely. When you work for a wage, you are selling a specific thing, not your time exactly, though time is the unit in which the wage is measured. You are selling your daily willingness to apply your capability to someone else's direction. The wage compensates you for that willingness. It does not compensate you for the full value your capability creates. It cannot, because if it did, the employer would have no reason to hire you. The employer pays you enough to secure your continued willingness to show up and apply your capability. The gap between what your capability creates and what the wage pays is the employer's reason for the arrangement. That gap is not a theft, it is the structure of the transaction. You are selling willingness to show up. The employer is buying the output of your capability applied in their direction. Both parties are getting something from the arrangement, but the directions of the accumulation are completely different. Every day you show up and apply your capability, the employer's system becomes slightly more valuable. The relationships you build with customers accrue to the employer's customer base. The process improvements you make accrue to the employer's operational efficiency. The reputation you build for quality and reliability accrues to the employer's brand. The institutional knowledge you develop about how to make the operation work better accumulates in the employer's organization. All of it stays when you leave. None of it travels with you except in your own memory and capability, which you then have to sell again to a new employer for a new wage. This is the trap. Not that wages are inadequate, though many are. The trap is that the direction of accumulation is permanently pointed away from you regardless of how hard you work or how much value your capability creates. You can work brilliantly for 40 years and create enormous value, and at the end of those 40 years have nothing that persists beyond your continued ability to show up and be willing. The moment you stop showing up, the wage stops, and if the wage stops, everything that was calibrated to the wage is threatened. The trap closes differently for different men, but it always closes the same way fundamentally. You receive the wage. You build a life calibrated to the wage. The life calibrated to the wage requires the wage to continue. The requirements of the life calibrated to the wage make it progressively harder to take the risk of leaving the wage to build something that accumulates in your direction. The longer you stay in the wage, the more the life around the wage requires the wage, and the more the wage feels like something you cannot afford to leave, even when you understand clearly that leaving it is the only way to the position you actually want. A man I knew in the Detroit manufacturing world in the years before I started the Ford Motor Company, a machinist named Edward, described this to me once in terms that I have thought about many times since. He said the wage feels like the floor until you realize it is the ceiling. He meant that when you first receive a wage that is adequate to your needs, it feels like a foundation. It supports everything above it. But after years of building a life on that foundation, of calibrating your expenses and your commitments and your obligations to the level the wage supports, the wage stops feeling like a floor and starts feeling like the limit of what is possible, because everything you have built requires it, and nothing you have built reduces that requirement. Edward stayed in the wage his entire working life. He was a genuinely skilled man, and his skill was recognized and rewarded with progressively better wages. He retired with enough to live on, modestly. He left his children nothing of substance beyond what he had managed to save from wages that were always being consumed by the life calibrated to them. He was not a failure by any normal measure. He was exactly what the wage system produces when it works as designed. A capable, reliable man who applies his capability to someone else's direction for his entire working life and receives in return a livable wage that ends when he does. The alternative is not dramatic, and it is not sudden, and it is not available through inspiration alone. It is a specific sequence of decisions that anyone who understands the trap clearly enough can begin to execute. The sequence does not require quitting your job. It does not require capital you do not have. It requires something more available and more difficult than either of those things. It requires hours that belong to you, directed at something that accumulates in your direction, applied consistently over the time it takes for that something to grow large enough to make the transition viable. This is exactly what I did in the years when I was working for Edison's company. I was the chief engineer of the Detroit plant. I had a good wage and a respected position and a clear path to advancement within the organization. I was also spending every hour that did not belong to Edison in a shed behind my house on Bagley Avenue, working on an engine that had nothing to do with Edison and everything to do with where I was actually going. The engine was not profitable. It produced no income. It produced knowledge and capability that accumulated in my direction rather than in Edison's, and that knowledge and capability was the foundation of everything that followed. The Ford Motor Company was built on what I built in that shed. The shed hours were the most important hours of my working life, not because they were the most productive in any given day, but because they were the only hours whose output accumulated to me rather than to someone else's system. This is the first step out of the wage trap. Not quitting the wage, adding to it, claiming the hours that belong to you, and directing them at something that builds in your direction. This is not complicated. It is difficult in a specific way that I want to describe honestly, because the difficulty is real, and pretending it is not real would make this advice useless. The hours that belong to you, the hours after work and before work and on weekends, and on the margins of days that are otherwise committed, are the hours your body most wants to use for rest, and your mind most wants to use for distraction. These are legitimate desires. The body that has been working all day for someone else genuinely needs recovery. The mind that has been applying itself to someone else's problems genuinely needs release. The pull toward rest and distraction in the hours after a day of wage work is not laziness. It is the natural response of a human organism that has been giving most of its daily energy to someone else. The discipline required to claim some portion of those hours for building, rather than giving all of them to rest and distraction, is real discipline, not the theatrical discipline of dramatic sacrifice. The quiet, daily discipline of choosing, on an ordinary evening when you are ordinarily tired, to give 1 hour to the shed, rather than to the easier alternative. This choice, made consistently across months and years, is what produces the foundation that eventually makes the transition possible. This choice, not made consistently, is what produces the condition of a man who understands the trap clearly and changes nothing about his daily behavior and wonders years later why nothing has changed. I want to be honest about something that I did not always admit about this period of my own building. There were evenings when I did not go to the shed. There were weeks when the pull of the daily work at Edison's company and the pull of the life Clara and I were building together crowded out the shed entirely. I am not describing a process of perfect daily discipline, applied without deviation over years. I am describing a direction that was maintained across enough days with enough consistency to produce a foundation that the occasional failure to show up did not destroy. The standard is not perfection. The standard is consistency across enough of the available time that the accumulation is real and growing. Here is the first exercise. It is the same exercise I gave myself in the early years on Bagley Avenue, and it reveals something that most men living inside the wage trap have never looked at directly. Write down every hour of a typical week, not your ideal week, the week you actually live. From the time you wake until the time you sleep, 7 days. Mark every hour that belongs to someone else's system. Your job, your commute, the obligations that are not optional. Mark the hours of genuine physical recovery that your body actually requires. Mark the hours of the obligations of the household that cannot be deferred. Now count what remains. For most men, what remains is not nothing. It is smaller than they expected and larger than they claimed when they said they had no time for building. It is real hours, actual hours, that are going somewhere. The question is where they are going. Write down where they are going honestly, not where you think they should be going. Where they actually go in the week you actually live. What you are looking at is the evidence of what you are actually building with the hours that belong to you. If the answer is that those hours are building rest and recovery and the daily pleasures of ordinary life, that is honest. But it is also the specific accounting of why nothing is accumulating in your direction from those hours. The decision to redirect even 1 hour a day from what it currently goes to towards something that builds in your direction is not a small decision. Over a year, it is 365 hours. Over 3 years, it is more than 1,000 hours of building applied consistently in one direction. 1,000 hours of focused building in a single direction, even applied without exceptional talent or extraordinary resources, produces something real, not something finished. Not something large enough to replace the wage yet. Something real, something that has taken a shape and has begun to demonstrate whether the direction is viable. This is the moment when the second decision becomes available. The decision to take the building seriously enough to protect it. Not just to work on it in the hours that naturally fall free. To actively defend those hours against the other claims that will always be available on them. The social world makes many claims on the hours that belong to you. Obligations to friends, to family, to the community relationships that constitute a normal life. These are not illegitimate claims. They are real and they matter, and the man who sacrifices all of them to the building produces a building and loses the relationships that make the building worth building for. But there is a difference between the obligations that genuinely require your presence and the social commitments that have been receiving your hours by default, because you had not yet made a specific claim on those hours for something you were building. The hours that have been going to default social commitments by the simple absence of a competing claim are hours that can be redirected without genuine cost to the relationships that actually matter. There was a man named William who worked in the plant at Highland Park in the years of the assembly line development. William was a capable worker and had ambitions beyond his position that he talked about frequently in the way that men in that situation talk about what they will do when circumstances align correctly. William had a specific skill in mechanical repair that went beyond what his current role required, and that was genuinely valuable in the broader market. He knew this. He talked about using it to build something of his own. For the years I knew him, the talking and the building were the same thing. He was spending his evenings in the conversations and the social routines that had been receiving his evenings before the building existed, and telling himself that the building would happen when things settled down, when he had a little more money saved, when the right opportunity became clearer. William's situation was not one of insufficient capability or insufficient opportunity. It was one of insufficient hours redirected toward the thing he said he wanted to build. The capability was there. The market for the capability was there. The hours were going elsewhere by default. And the default continued, year after year, because no specific competing claim had been made on those hours strong enough to displace the default. This is the second form of the wage trap. The first form is the accumulation trap. The wage accumulates nothing in your direction. The second form is the time trap. The hours that belong to you accumulate nothing because they have been given to defaults that are easier than the difficulty of building in those hours. The escape from the second form requires the same decision as the escape from the first, not a dramatic decision. A quiet, daily, repeated decision to claim the available hours for the building before the defaults claim them. This requires making the building specific enough to claim the hours rather than vague enough to be deferred. A building project that is specific has a task available for tonight. A building project that is vague has a shape that requires further thinking before any concrete work is possible, and further thinking has a way of being deferred indefinitely because thinking feels like it should happen when conditions are better rather than now. The building must be specific. What is the thing you are building? Who specifically needs it? What specifically would the working version of it do for them that they cannot currently get elsewhere? What is the specific next action that moves it from where it is today toward where it needs to be? If you can answer those 4 questions for the building you say you want to pursue, you have a task for tonight. If you cannot, the building is still in the stage of being a category of aspiration rather than a specific project with a specific next step. Make it specific. Write the 4 answers. Then do the specific next action in the next hour that belongs to you. Not this weekend. Not next week. The next hour that belongs to you. Starting tonight. Now I want to describe the third stage of getting out of the wage trap, which is the stage that most advice on this subject skips over entirely because it is the most uncomfortable stage and the most practically important one. The third stage is building long enough and specifically enough that the building begins to produce evidence. Not income yet, necessarily. Evidence. Evidence is the specific demonstrated result that shows the building is working in the direction of something real rather than in the direction of something hoped for. Evidence can be a customer who paid something, however small, for the first thing you produced. Evidence can be a problem that was genuinely solved by what you built for someone who genuinely had it. Evidence can be the specific knowledge, accumulated through the building, that tells you the approach is right and the direction is correct. Evidence is what sustains the conviction through the years of building before the building is large enough to replace the wage. Without evidence, the building is sustained by belief alone, and belief is fragile in a way that evidence is not. Belief wavers on difficult evenings when the building has produced nothing visible, and the wage represents a certain and comfortable alternative to the uncertainty of the building. Evidence does not waver. Evidence is a specific thing that happened because you built it, and that specific thing remains true regardless of how difficult the current evening is. The pursuit of early evidence is one of the most important practical decisions in the building process. It means starting with something small enough to be completed and delivered to someone who actually needs it quickly enough that the feedback arrives before the conviction has had time to erode, not the full vision. The smallest version of the thing that could be genuinely useful to a real person. Build that first. Get it to that person. Observe what happens when they use it. The observation is evidence. The evidence is the fuel that sustains the building through the next stage and the stage after that. This is what I did in the shed on Bagley Avenue. I was not building the Model T in those years. I was building an engine. The smallest version of the thing I needed to demonstrate was a working internal combustion engine mounted on a vehicle that moved under its own power. When I achieved that, the evidence was specific and real. It was not income. It was not a company. But it was evidence that the direction was viable and the approach was correct. And that evidence sustained the next years of development through periods of significant difficulty that would have been hard to sustain on belief alone. Build for evidence early, not for income yet, not for scale yet, for the specific demonstrated result that tells you, and anyone watching, that what you are building actually works in the real world for a real person. That result, however small, is the foundation of everything that follows. You cannot build a company on hope. You can build a company on evidence that has been gradually accumulated through a series of increasingly significant demonstrated results, starting from the smallest one that could have been genuinely useful to anyone. The second exercise is this. Write down the smallest version of what you are building that could be genuinely useful to one specific real person. Not the full version. Not the impressive version. The minimum version that actually solves the actual problem for an actual person who actually has it. Then write the name of one person you know who has that problem and would genuinely benefit from even this minimum version. Then describe one concrete action you could take in the next 7 days that would produce something you could give to that person and observe their response to. This is the evidence pursuit in its most practical form. One person, one minimum version, one observation. The observation is worth more than any amount of planning or any size of vision statement, because the observation is specific information about whether the building is working in the real world. And specific information about whether the building is working in the real world is the most valuable input available to a builder in the early stages, worth more than any amount of encouragement or any quality of advice. I want to describe the specific moment in my own building history when the accumulation in the building first exceeded the security of the wage in a way that made the transition from wage work to building work feel like following. The evidence, rather than leaping into uncertainty, because this moment is not where most people expect it to be, and describing it accurately is important for anyone who is waiting for a different kind of moment before they consider making the transition. The moment did not feel like readiness. It felt like obligation. The building had grown large enough and specific enough and evidenced enough that continuing to give most of my daily hours to someone else's direction while the building was demanding direction from me felt like a failure of responsibility to the thing I had built, rather than a courageous leap toward something new. The transition was not brave, it was responsive. The building had grown to the point where it required the hours I was giving to the wage, and giving the wage the hours that the building required felt like the riskier choice rather than the safer one. This is the third form of the wage trap, and the most subtle one. The trap inverts when the building has grown sufficiently. The wage, which felt like safety at the beginning and like a familiar constraint in the middle years, becomes the risk when the building has grown large enough to need what the wage is taking. At that stage, staying in the wage is not the safe choice. It is the choice that risks the building dying from insufficient attention at the moment when it most needs attention. And the building dying at that moment is a greater loss than the loss of the wage would have been. Most men who are inside the wage trap never reach this stage because they never built the building far enough to feel this inversion. They stay in the comfortable stage where the wage is clearly safer than the building, and the building's demands are modest enough to be met with the leftover hours. The inversion requires building past the point of comfort, into the stage where the building is demanding more than the leftover hours can provide, and responding to that demand by giving it the hours, rather than letting the demand signal the impossibility of continuing. When the building demands more than you have been giving it, that demand is not a sign to stop. It is the sign that the building has grown beyond the leftover hours stage into the stage that requires the main hours. Respond to it by giving it the main hours, not all at once if the wage is still necessary, but in increasing proportion and with the explicit understanding that the direction of travel is toward giving the building the primary hours and the wage the secondary ones rather than the reverse. I left Edison's company when the building had grown to the point where this inversion was impossible to deny, not when I felt ready, not when I felt certain. When the demand from the building had grown large enough that meeting it required the hours I was giving to the wage, and I understood clearly that giving the wage those hours while the building went unserved was the choice that would cost me more than the alternative. This is the moment you are working toward. not the moment of readiness or certainty. The moment when the building's demand is undeniable, and the response to that demand is what separates the men who complete the transition from the men who talk about completing it for the rest of their working lives. The full practical sequence of getting out of the wage trap is therefore this. Claim the hours that belong to you for something specific that builds in your direction. Make the building specific enough to have a task available for tonight. Build for early evidence rather than for early income. Sustain the building through the evidence it produces until the demand from the building exceeds what the leftover hours can meet. Then respond to that demand by giving the building the primary hours. And measure your progress at every stage, not by how impressive the building is or how certain the outcome feels, but by how many hours you are giving to building in your direction versus someone else's direction, and whether that ratio is moving toward building or toward wage. The trap closes the same way for everyone. It opens the same way too. 1 hour, one specific task, one piece of evidence pursued, one stage sustained long enough to become the next. The men who get out of the trap are not the men with more talent or more capital or more fortunate circumstances. They are the men who started the sequence and continued it past the point where most men stop because the discomfort of the building in the leftover hours is greater than the discomfort of staying in the trap. Most men stop because the trap is comfortable enough. The wage is adequate. The life calibrated to the wage is good enough. The building in the leftover hours is hard and uncertain and produces nothing visible for a long time. The decision to continue the sequence past the comfort stage is the decision that the trap is designed to make unnecessary. The more comfortable the wage, the less the trap feels like a trap, and the less it feels like a trap, the less the motivation to pursue the discomfort of getting out of it. I am telling you clearly that the comfort is the trap, not the wage, not the work. The comfort that the wage purchases is the specific thing that makes the trap effective. A man in an uncomfortable wage situation feels the trap clearly because the discomfort makes the alternative visible. A man in a comfortable wage situation does not feel the trap at all. He feels stability. He feels security. He feels the reasonable satisfaction of a man whose life is working adequately. And the adequate working of the life calibrated to the wage is the most effective trap mechanism there is, because it removes the urgency that makes change possible. If your wage situation is comfortable, the specific action required is to manufacture urgency from understanding rather than waiting for urgency from discomfort. Understand clearly what the comfortable wage produces at its endpoint. Understand clearly what remains when the wage stops. Understand clearly what the men who stayed in comfortable wages their entire working lives had to show for the decade of excellent, comfortable work at the end. That understanding, if it is specific and honest rather than vague and optimistic, produces the urgency that the comfortable trap removes. And that urgency is what makes the first claiming of the building hours possible before the discomfort of the situation forces it. Build now, not when the situation becomes uncomfortable enough to require it. Now, from the clarity of understanding what the trap produces, rather than from the urgency of what the discomfort feels like. The wage is not the enemy. The wage is often necessary and sometimes excellent and frequently the right arrangement for a specific period of a working life. The trap is not the wage. The trap is the life calibrated to the wage that makes every transition away from the wage feel like a risk that the stability of the current situation does not require taking. Take the risk from clarity rather than from desperation. Build in the hours that belong to you starting tonight. Make the building specific enough to have a task for tonight. Pursue early evidence before early income. Sustain the building past the comfort stage, and respond to the building's demand when it grows large enough to demand the primary hours. That is the sequence. It is the sequence I followed in the shed on Bagley Avenue. It is the sequence that produced the Ford Motor Company, not from genius or from luck or from circumstances that were uniquely favorable, but from the consistent application of building hours to a specific building project over the time it took for the building to grow large enough to demand the primary hours, and for the response to that demand to become the obvious choice, rather than the risky one. The trap is real. The sequence to exit it is real. The choice of which of those realities you live inside for the rest of your working life is yours to make starting from the next hour that belongs to you. Listen to this again tomorrow. The part of it that connects most directly to where you currently are in the sequence will be clearer the second time. I want to give you the specific picture of what the building looks like at each stage, because the abstract description of stages is less useful than a concrete picture of what you are actually doing in each one. In the first stage, the building is entirely invisible to everyone but you. You are giving 1 or 2 hours of your off time to something that has not yet produced any visible result for anyone. The task for each session is small and specific, and aimed at demonstrating something to yourself rather than to anyone else. You are learning whether the direction is viable. You are developing the capability needed to build in this direction. You are answering the question of whether you are the person who can build this thing or whether the idea is real, but you are not the right builder for it. This stage is uncomfortable because you are working in the dark, and the discomfort of working in the dark, with no external confirmation that the direction is right, is the specific discomfort that eliminates most men before they reach the second stage. In the second stage, the building has produced something small enough to be given to one person. That person's response is your first evidence. It may be positive, or it may reveal a problem with the direction that requires revision. Either response is valuable. The positive response confirms the direction and gives you the first external confirmation that what you are building serves a real need. The negative response, if it is honest and specific, gives you specific information about what to change. The worst response is indifference. Not because indifference is painful, but because indifference suggests the thing you built does not address a need that the person you built it for actually felt. Indifference is information. It means either the person is the wrong target or the thing is the wrong solution. Both are useful discoveries that redirect the building before more hours have been invested in the wrong direction. In the third stage, the building has produced enough evidence from enough people that the direction is clearly viable. And the question has shifted from whether the building can produce something real to how to produce more of it with less of your time. This is the stage where the building begins to demand more than the leftover hours can provide. The demand is the signal. The response to the demand is the decision. Most men are stopped somewhere in the first stage, not because they are incapable of building or because the thing they want to build is not real. Because the first stage requires the specific discipline of applying effort to something that produces nothing visible for an extended period, while the wage is producing something visible and stable. The asymmetry between the certainty of the wage and the uncertainty of the early building stage is the psychological heart of the trap. The way through the first stage is what I described earlier. Evidence, early and small and specific, not income, not scale. A single real result for a single real person. That result changes the nature of the building from a private conviction to a demonstrated capability. And demonstrated capability, even at the smallest scale, sustains the conviction through the subsequent building in a way that private conviction alone cannot. I want to describe a specific thing about the first stage that I have rarely heard described honestly, and that I think prevents many capable men from entering it at all. The first stage is where you discover whether the idea you have been carrying is an idea about building or an idea about having built. These are different things. An idea about building is an idea that generates specific tasks. An idea about having built is an idea that generates a picture of the completed state without generating the specific tasks required to reach it. Most ideas that men carry around for years are ideas about having built. They produce visions of the finished thing and the life that the finished thing makes possible. They do not naturally produce a task for tonight. The test is simple. Take the idea you have been carrying. Ask what the specific task for tonight is. If a specific task is immediately available, the idea is about building. If the mind goes to the vision of the completed thing and the question of the task for tonight produces a sense that more planning is required before any task is possible, the idea is about having built. This is not a permanent condition. Ideas about having built can be converted into ideas about building by the application of one specific question. What is the smallest thing I could make in the next 3 hours that would tell me something true about whether this direction is viable? The answer to that question is always a specific task. And the specific task is the entry into the first stage of building. The men who complete the transition from wage to building are not the men with better ideas. They are the men whose relationship to their ideas is different. They have converted ideas about having built into ideas about building by the consistent application of the question, what is the task for tonight? And they have applied the tasks consistently enough to move from the first stage to the second to the third and eventually to the demand that signals the transition. Now I want to speak about the role of money in this sequence, because money is where most people's thinking about the transition gets confused in specific ways that make the transition seem harder than it is. The common belief is that the transition from wage to building requires a sum of money sufficient to sustain the life calibrated to the wage, while the building is generating no income. This belief is true in a narrow sense and misleading in the practical sense. It is true that the transition eventually requires either savings sufficient to bridge the gap, or a building that is producing enough income to partially replace the wage before the full transition is made. But the belief becomes misleading when it is used to justify never starting the building until the sufficient sum has been accumulated, because the sufficient sum almost never accumulates from the wage alone, because the life calibrated to the wage consumes the wage at roughly the rate it arrives. The practical alternative is not to wait for the sum, but to begin the building before the sum is available, and to build the building toward the point where it produces partial income before the full transition is required. A building that produces some income changes the equation of the transition entirely. Even a small income from the building reduces the size of the gap that savings must bridge. And small income from the building, at whatever stage the building produces it, is evidence of a different and more sustaining kind than the evidence of demonstrated capability without income. It is evidence that the building produces value that someone will pay for, and that evidence is the foundation of the next stage of building. Do not wait for the money to start the building. Start the building before the money is available. Build toward the earliest possible point at which the building produces any income, however small. Use that income as the foundation for the transition rather than trying to accumulate the transition capital from the wage. The building that generates income is self-evidencing in a way that the building that has not yet generated income is not. And self-evidencing building attracts the additional resources, the attention, the partnership, the investment that incomeless building cannot attract, regardless of how evident its potential is to the person doing the building. The wage trap is sustained, in its final form, by the belief that the transition requires a readiness that the current situation cannot provide, that more savings are needed, or more time, or more certainty about the direction, or more development of the building before the transition can be responsible. All of these beliefs are partially true and fully trap-sustaining. Some additional savings are always useful. Some additional time for the building to develop is always available. Some additional certainty about the direction always reduces the risk of the transition, but the additional savings never accumulate fast enough from the wage. The additional time never quite resolves the questions that feel unresolved. The additional certainty never quite reaches the threshold that would make the transition feel unambiguously right. The trap is not broken by the arrival of readiness. It is broken by the decision to move before readiness arrives and to trust the building's demonstrated evidence rather than the wage's demonstrated reliability. That decision is available at a much earlier stage of the building than most men believe. And the men who make it at that earlier stage build the things that the men who waited for readiness never built. Because the things that get built are always built by the men who started before they were ready, rather than the men who waited until the readiness felt sufficient. Start before you are ready. Build from what you have. Trust the evidence the building produces more than the comfort the wage provides. And move through the stages in sequence, one task at a time, until the demand from the building makes the transition the obvious response rather than the risky one. That is the exit from the wage trap, not the dramatic leap. The quiet sequence, applied consistently, until the sequence itself produces the conditions for the transition. Build the foundation in the leftover hours. Build past the first evidence. Build past the comfort stage. Build until the demand arrives. Respond to the demand. and measure yourself at every stage by the ratio of building hours to wage hours and the direction that ratio is moving. Listen to this every night. The stage of the sequence you are currently in will be clearer each time you hear it. There is one more dimension of the wage trap that I want to name before I close, because it is the one that affects the men who have already begun the building and are in the early stages and are most at risk of stopping before the evidence arrives. The trap has a psychological version that is separate from the mechanical version I have been describing. The mechanical version is the accumulation trap and the time trap and the comfort trap. The psychological version is the comparison trap, and the comparison trap operates like this. While you are in the early stages of building, giving your off hours to something that has not yet produced visible evidence, the men around you who are staying in the wage are visibly accumulating the things that wages purchase: better positions, higher salaries, nicer circumstances. The visible accumulation of the man who stayed in the wage, while you are in the invisible accumulation stage of the building, creates a specific pressure that is easy to mistake for evidence that the building is wrong and the wage was right. It is not evidence of this. It is the natural result of comparing two different timescales at the wrong point in each of them. The man who stays in the wage is accumulating wage things at the fast rate that wages accumulate them. The man building is accumulating building things at the slow rate that buildings accumulate in the early stages. The comparison at this point favors the wage man visibly and completely. This is not information about which path leads to a better destination. It is information about which path produces visible results faster in the early stages. The fast visible results of the wage and the slow invisible results of the building are not comparable at this stage because they are aimed at different endpoints on different timescales. Carnegie put this to me once in terms that I have carried since. He said the man who plants an orchard must watch his neighbors harvest grain for years before he harvests anything. The grain farmer and the orchard planter are both working. Both are producing something real. But the comparison at any point before the orchard matures will always favor the grain farmer visibly. This does not mean the orchard was the wrong decision. It means that different plantings have different timescales, and that comparing their results at the wrong point in each produces wrong conclusions. Know the timescale of your building. Know that the comparison between your early building results and the wage results of the men around you is a comparison at the wrong point in both timescales. And sustain the building past the comparison period, through the invisible accumulation stage, into the stage where the building produces its own visible evidence and the comparison changes in the direction of the building. The men who complete the exit from the wage trap are not the men who avoided the comparison trap. They are the men who recognized it clearly enough to not let it determine their decisions. They felt the pressure of the comparison. They saw the visible accumulation of the men who stayed in the wage. They experienced the specific discomfort of being in the invisible accumulation stage while surrounded by people in the fast visible accumulation stage. And they sustained the building anyway, because they understood clearly that the comparison was not evidence, and the discomfort of the comparison was not information about the correctness of the direction. Sustain the building past the comparison period. That is the final practical instruction. Sustain it past the period when the men around you in the wage are accumulating faster and more visibly than your building is accumulating. Sustain it past the first year when nothing visible has been produced, and the second year when the evidence is small, and the third year when the demand has not yet arrived. Sustain it because the direction is right, and the evidence you have produced confirms the direction is right, and the time scale of the building is different from the time scale of the wage, and the comparison between them at this point is not information about which leads to a better destination. This is what I did in the shed on Bagley Avenue through the years when other engineers at Edison's company were advancing in positions and receiving recognition for work that produced visible results within the organization. I was producing nothing visible to anyone outside the shed. The comparison favored them at every point in those years. I sustained the building because the direction was right and the evidence from the building was real, and the time scale of the building was not the time scale of the comparison. Plant the orchard, water it, Watch the grain farmers harvest around you while your orchard is still in the invisible accumulation stage, and sustain it past that stage until the harvest that the orchard produces is incomparable to what the grain field would have produced over the same years. That is the exit from the wage trap in its complete form. Start the sequence. Sustain it past the discomfort. Sustain it past the comparison. Respond to the demand when it arrives. And measure your life at the end by what accumulated in your direction across the years of building rather than by what the wage would have accumulated if you had stayed in it. Listen to this again tomorrow. The stage you are at will be clearer with each listening.